It's going on 3 o'clock on July the 6th, and it is a super hot day here in Fullerton in North Orange County. I've got several apps that say that it's between 109 and 113 right now, so I'll accept that it's something in the range of 110 to 112. And so I'm going to go inside and see if I can't find something else that we can do in the cool that has to do with California native plants. So what can we do on such a super hot day when you would be nuts to think about planting just about anything? Well, one thing that we can do is look at books on California native plants. So I've got some things here that I've got lined up. Almost all of them except for this last one is all on California or California native plants. We'll start with these two. Each of these books is by Greg Rubin and Lucy Warren. The one on the left is 2016 and is a little smaller. It seems to be something of an abridgment of the book on the right, which is the 2013. And what you'll find by looking at the table of contents of the book California Native Landscape is that it's got a really broad treatment covering soils, design types, garden styles, and then of course a huge section on the different kind of plants, followed by installation, maintenance and care, and various other things. How does this book compare, the smaller book, the one published in 2016 that is called The Drought-defying California Garden, 230 native plants for a lush, low-water landscape? And the subtitle really gives the key there. This is really a focus on the plants themselves. There is some discussion about plant communities, and then it just goes through and talks about trees, shrubs, ground covers, and perennials, etc., with a small section on installation and a small section on maintenance and care. If all you needed was something that just talked about well adapted to the garden California native plants, then that book would be it. But I would recommend probably that for most people, I think they'd really enjoy this book, and they would find that it had a lot of useful things in it, more than simply on the plants themselves. And let me just give you one for instance. It's got a chapter on garden style, and so it covers contemporary or modern style, Mediterranean style. Since my house is Mediterranean style, I took a close look at this. Desert or Southwestern style, Asian or Japanese style, and contemporary or modern style. And then with some examples for each one of these to give you sort of the flavor of each before it gets to the section on plant selection. So both of these are really good. If you don't need the extra material in this one, then go ahead and get this one. But this one is a really good book. Let's go on to this one by Carol Boorstein, David Fross, and Bart O'Brien. This one is California Native Plants for the Garden. This one, instead of being arranged by shrub, tree, vine, and so forth, it is just simply alphabetical by the technical name. I don't know about you, but my experience has been, you buy one book, even if it's a classic. If you buy 2 or 3 books to read about the subject, you always feel like you've learned more than if you just buy one, because you're seeing it from multiple different angles. So these 2 books right here would be a good place to start for California native. What then can M. Nevin Smith's book, Native Treasures Gardening with the Plants of California, what could that possibly add to the mix? Well, I'll tell you. What he adds is comments about the garden performance of different kind of plants. So not only does he break down, I'm in Ceanothus right here. So there's Ray Hartman and Sierra Blue. I've got some Ray Hartman and Sierra Blue, as you can see by the tabs I've put there. And some concha. I've got some concha. And he gives some comments about basically the plant culture and its performance, and particularly its performance in the garden, and in addition, its performance in Northern California versus Southern California, or even more specific than that. And that is really helpful because you kind of get the impression from reading those two or three. Well, I don't want to overstate it, but they don't have as many warnings about temperamental varieties as this book does by M. Niven Smith. You get the idea that Mr. Smith has been out collecting seeds all over the state of California for a good part of his life, and that he's planted them and grown them, and he really knows about the performance of those things. So that's the particular value that I've found in that book. Now we go to Nancy Bauer's book, The California Wildlife Habitat Garden, with the subtitle of How to Attract Bees, Butterflies, and Birds and Other Animals into Your Habitat Garden. And all you've got to do is just look to this table of contents to give you some sense of what it is that she's up to. She's going to different types of habitat gardens and then showing you how it was laid out and what are the plant varieties that it's got. By reading in one or more of these, you'll get some ideas for some things that you can add to your garden habitat to make it more attractive to birds and animals. One by Fred Heath is an introduction to Southern California butterflies. And this has got, boy, just about everything you'd want to have on the various kinds of butterflies and their habitat and their habit and their culture and their distribution, and obviously on identification. I think most of us get a book like this with the primary goal of helping us with identification, but this has got much, much more than that. That's a really helpful book. This one is a giant of a book. It's by Bob Perry, and it's Landscape Plans for California Gardens. This is sort of every plant that is in the horticultural trade in California. So it's not by any stretch limited to California natives, but of course it's got lots and lots of California natives in it, but it's also got much, much more than that. If it's growing here in California, there's a pretty good chance that he makes mention of it and once again tells you about its culture and its performance and everything else you would want to know. Now we're getting to some real favorites. This one by Barbour, Evans, Keeler-Wolf, and Sawyer, California's Botanical Landscapes, and the subtitle gives you a pretty good hint of what this book is up to, a pictorial view of the state's vegetation. And so this goes from north to south, to east to west, and what have I got it on? Montane Forest is where I've got a book marker. Oh yeah, look at that. That's bristlecone pines up in the White Mountains. And then it covers all of our forests and all of our deserts and all of our coastlines and all of our valleys and everything in between. This is just a wonderful book. My gosh, you look at that. Look at the beautiful photography in it. This is just great for any time of day or night to just sit down and do some browsing. It's got informative text, but there's a real emphasis on letting the pictures portray the beauty of our California landscape. So what does this one add that the other one doesn't? The first one covers a panoramic view of all of the different types of landscapes and plant communities in California. This one goes to particularly noteworthy or memorable sites to give you a view of what some of these places are. So this is going to take you to particular places and are going to show you particular plant communities. So if you're like me, you'll go through and find some that you're familiar with and you've been to before, but you'll find lots that you have not been to and you don't know that much about. And it's a really good introduction to some beautiful places to go and visit someday. This last book has nothing to do with California native plants specifically. John Brooks was an English landscape architect, and this is one of his books. I'm not even sure that it's the best, but it's a good one. And the things that he seemed to admire was things that, after all, he wanted it to be a garden, so it ought to have some order and harmony in it, but he always introduced an element of wildness to it. And so you get this interesting combination of order and wildness, and it happens over and over again. So I thought I could maybe show you some examples. To me, there's both order and wildness in that. In here you can certainly see elements of order in the color palette, but also the wildness of it, and the same thing with this one as well. And let's see if I've got, so here's another one, both order and wildness. And there's another one, and I think maybe there's, okay. Now here's one, you got that wild looking stone and no particular pattern to the plants and the trees over there, but you got that spotted grass over there. This is a garden. And so this also has both order and wildness in it. So he talked about swaths of color, lines of color, slabs of color. He was the opposite of somebody who would replant their front yard with 25 plants, and each one of the plants was a different kind, 25 one-off plants. Instead, not only would he plant in drifts of 3, 5, 7, and 9, but he'd make drifts of 15, 17, 19 or more plants, so that you got a nice, what he called a solid mass. And then he'd interlock those in interesting ways. He talked about garden rooms. Each corner of the garden would be a room, and each room had a different quality to it. And finally, one of the thoughts that has really stuck with me was the idea that a garden is a retreat, but it's not like the 16th century retreat, which was a retreat from the awfulness of nature. But the modern garden is a retreat from the awfulness of modern life. So where before they were trying to make it entirely orderly, and now pushing back on that order, it's still there. The harmony is still there, the continuity is still there, the theme is still there, but there's always, he would say, ought to be an element of wildness to it. I hardly ever looked at anything he designed and didn't think to myself, that's just amazing. John Brooks, really what a great designer. One final thought about John Brooks. Nearly 20 years ago, Judith Larner Lowry wrote Gardening with a Wild Heart, which was for me a transformative book. And even though Brooks knew a lot more about English gardens than he did about California gardens, but his idea about preserving or reintroducing wildness into our gardening, that seems to be very much in line with Lowry's idea about gardening with a wild heart. Of course, Lowry is definitely a California native plant gardener and advocate. But I think that Brooks' idea about wildness and Lowry's idea about gardening with a wild heart, I think they were in line with one another. Brooks is just a great designer, and I certainly get a lot of inspiration from his designs. So there it is, 10 books, more than you need, but on the other hand, you'd get something useful out of each one of these. And so that's 10 books, which would be a really great introduction to, boy, just about everything you need or want to know about California native plants, native landscape design, wildlife plant habitat, and so on and so forth.